talk about what I loosely call contact herbicides. Our first meeting, I talked about pre-emergent herbicides. These are post-emergent herbicides. And I got to give credit, I'm going to give credit to Mike Bazideau up in the Champlain Valley region, Cornell Extension, north of Albany. He gave a talk during one of their thinning meetings about a quick talk like this about contact herbicides. And I thought it would be a good idea to review them, and I borrowed some stuff from his talk so I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Anyways, why do we want to use contact herbicides now? Well, if you've got weeds out there, they're competing for space, competing for water, competing for nutrients. Right now is a really good time to get the weed situation under control, because later in the season, when the weeds are more mature and taller, they'll be harder to control. Weeds are a significant habitat for various pests, so they're just not a good thing to have around in your orchard. Late in the season, they can also interfere with harvest. Good weed control is particularly important in dwarf apple tree plantings. Those dwarf apple trees have small root systems when they're getting established, and even when they are permanently established, the root system is shallow and weak. That's why they're dwarf, or part of the reason they're dwarf. So that's why you want to focus on weed control now. Weed control is, it's like any other pest. We should be using integrated pest management, and that includes a lot of different things, whether it's herbicides, cultural practices, etc. Hopefully you already applied a pre-emergent residual herbicide, so you have some weed control, but typically that is not 100% effective, and we have weeds breaking through now that need to be hit with a contact herbicide. Keeping your middles mowed so the grasses and broadleaf weeds don't grow up and go to seed is not a bad idea. If you let them go to seed, that's not a very good IPM practice for sure. Watch your herbicide strips. What weed species are present? Are they annual leaves, perennial leaves, broadleaf weeds, grasses? Identify your pest. They're kind of an important part of IPM. Dry weather right now makes contact herbicide application less effective, so you may want to wait till we get a little bit of rain, because the herbicides will work better. All right, I'm going to run down quickly the options. Most of you probably are pretty familiar with these, but let's talk about Paraquat first. Paraquat is not systemic, it's just a burn down. It's very effective and quick on annual broadleaf weeds and grasses when they're small. When they get larger, it doesn't work quite as well. When they get bigger, they've got thicker skin, and Paraquat does not work particularly well. It'll burn down perennial weeds a little bit, but they'll come right back. Now, there's new rules for Paraquat. First of all, only certified applicators can apply. You need to have a pesticide applicator's license to even think about applying Paraquat. Your help cannot apply it even under your supervision if they don't have a license. And there's a mandatory training program. Every 3 years you have to take it. You can go to USParaquattraining.com, do that training and get a certificate so you're trained. This fall coming up, there'll be a closed container requirement, a closed system, whereas Paraquat will only be dispensed with like a pump or something like that. I'm not totally familiar with what it'll look like. Not sure I really care, because I'll tell you why I don't care. Gramoxone's one of the more common brand names. It's a restricted use pesticide due to acute toxicity. Has a danger, poison signal word. Why would you even want to have it around? I wouldn't. I don't plan on using it anymore, ever again. Even though I took the training. I just wanted to see what it was like. All right, so if you don't want to use Paraquat, what's a good option? Well, Rely is glufosinate ammonium. That was the brand name. It's gone generic. Cheetah is fairly common, I guess, now as far as a Rely product. It can be used on all tree fruit crops. I'm not going to get into rates too much, because you really want to look at the label and use rates based on what kind of weeds you're trying to control. It's not particularly systemic. It's just a contact herbicide, but it'll take care of broadleaf weeds and grasses, less so on grasses. It's poor on perennial weeds. If you spray glufosinate ammonium on perennial weeds, they'll come back. It'll burn back suckers on apple trees, but, and I want to make this very clear because right on the label it says, do not spray this, rely on green bark, stems, foliage, particularly bark. If you spray it on bark, unless it's very thick, old bark, you can damage your trees. So I think that when using Rely on younger trees, dwarf plantings, you really need to protect the trees from spray, the trunk using wraps, grow tubes, wax containers. A thick coat of white paint will do it, but you don't want to get glufosinate ammonium on your tree trunks. And, you know, you could say the same, even though I'm not going to use gramoxone, you could say the same thing for Paraquat. You don't want to be spraying any of these contact herbicides directly on your tree trunks, especially on young trees. And the same thing could be said for glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup. I like the branding of this particular one, Mad Dog. Now, glyphosate is really, truly the only systemic contact herbicide we have. I said I wouldn't talk about rates, but boy, if you look at the label on glyphosate, it's very complicated. But typically, I use 1 to 2 quarts per sprayed acre. A 1 to 2% spray solution works pretty good. On annual broadleaf weeds and grasses, it also works on perennial weeds as long as you get a good coat on those perennial weeds. Again, avoid contact with plants, including the trunks. You want to avoid application after July 1st because the glyphosate, if you do hit root suckers or you hit foliage, that's more likely to cause long-term problems because it can go down the root system. It can kill young trees if you're not careful. And you can get injury. You'll see injury next year. You be careful with glyphosate. You just don't want to get it on any part of your plant, just on the weeds. It can be used on peaches, but again, use very carefully. You don't want to get it on any of the peach tree at all, period. And again, use extreme care to avoid contact with the trunk or any part of the foliage. And those instructions are very clear on the label. Then we got 2,4-D. I take, you know, actually 2,4-D is systemic too, but it's only on broadleaf weeds, annual and perennial broadleaf weeds, less so. You don't want to use 2,4-D. Unison is a Helena brand name on on or near, not on grapes at all, near grapes, because some grape varieties are very sensitive to 2,4-D. It's very volatile, although the Unison is less so. Again, avoid contact with foliage, tree trunks. Do not use year of planting. You should look at the label for all these to see what kind of restrictions there are on age of tree planting and the crops. I think the best use of 2,4-D is in the fall on dandelions and the orchard middles. There's many good reasons for getting rid of those. Not everybody does it, but I don't think it's a bad idea. Corporal Ed Stinger brand name is another auxin herbicide, auxinic herbicide like 2,4-D. Again, it's broadleaf only. It's particularly good on clover. 2,4-D itself is not as good on clover. So again, if you want to spray it in the row middles to get rid of clover in the fall, it's a good product to use. It's its best use if you want my opinion. There's some of these newer group 14 herbicides, AIM, Venue, and Trevix. They're selective only for broadleaf weeds, best used when the weeds are small. Again, read the specific product label for age restrictions and the crops they can be used on. They can generally be safely used on root suckers, but again, keep them off green trunks. If you've got a lot of suckers, it's relatively easy to do that, but you don't want to be blasting the trunks with any of these products. These may be synergistic when mixed with other contact herbicides. For example, I like to use them with Rely. They'll provide faster burn down. And I think some better perennial weed control, such as bittersweet, you know, that's a tough one. So isn't bindweed. So when mixed with either Roundup or Rely, it's a good tank mix to be used. Any of these 3 products. I've never used Post. It's selective for just annual and perennial grasses. Maybe other people have used it. We have some persnickety perennial grasses in Belchertown, which I haven't quite 100% figured out how to control. I wish I could try this sometime, just haven't got around to it. But that's kind of a grass, the only grass specific um, selective post-emergent herbicide. There's a couple, Psy is not organic, but if you want to use something more organic oriented is decent. It's not very cost effective, but it will burn down most weeds. Suppress, I haven't used, is organic. I understand it's fairly good, but these have to be applied frequently when the weeds are small or young, and I don't think are cheap. Just wanted to mention, though, there are a couple of organic options. In summary, read the herbicide labels. Rates vary depending on the weed species trying to be controlled. Did I mention that most of these products work best when the weeds are small, 6, 8 inches, not when they've gotten up to be 12 to 18 inches. Check for the specific crop and tree age used. Some of them can't be used on stone fruit or certain stone fruits. The addition of a crop oil concentrate or other surfactants is often recommended on the label. Anti-drift agents are good. I like to use an anti-drift agent when I'm spraying herbicides. Tank mix partners are often specified and recommended. Avoid contact with anything but weeds. They kill plants, so be careful. I also like to use air induction nozzles. Consider using shielding, and proper calibration is kind of important. Our tree fruit guide has a whole chapter on weeds, including specific recommendations, what crops it can or can't be used on, tree age, etc. So check that out when you get a chance. That's the end.